İlber Ortaylı, Ottoman Studies. The problem of nationalities in the Ottoman Empire following the siege of Vienna. Part 1. One unquestioned development in the Ottoman Empire following the second siege of Vienna is the clear-cut emergence of the problem of nationalities. Doubtless the causes of this go back to before the rout in which the siege ended. It is also true that here, at the end of the 17th century, it was demonstrated not only to the powers of Europe, but also to the Balkan peoples living under the Sultan, that the Ottoman might was capable of defeat and even debacle. This was a stimulus to them in organizing national movements. Ottoman Rumelia of the later 17th century was a host to a very different dynamism than had existed before. Meanwhile, thanks to the hastening induced by the rout at Vienna of the process of administrative change, the Turkish element within the empire's Muslim populations acquired a greater role in matters of government. Thus, though the overriding culture and the process of ruling were still Ottoman, Turkish Anatolia began definitely to come to the fore, with the net result that the traditionally structured empire, until then Ottoman, in character, because cosmopolitan, as ancient Rome and medieval Byzantium had been cosmopolitan, was in actual fact ceasing to be Ottoman. By the time we reach the 18th and 19th century, the Ottoman state has assumed all the earmarks of a political and social system in which the problem of disruptive nationalism is the predominant factor. Conquest in the Balkans during the 14th century in a way brought stability to the region. The throes of social change that tossed the Balkans throughout the 14th and 15th century were quelled in the restoration of stability and a feudal system. But inevitably, as Ottoman power reached its zenith in the 16th century, the beginnings of economic and social unrest began to make themselves felt, not only in Rumelia, but more particularly in Anatolia as well. Coming up to the 17th century, we see an empire that has lost its former might and carried inexorably forward by the stream of time, finds itself unable to adapt in a modern world of changing conditions, so much so that it is still an unresolved question of historiography how the Ottoman armies managed in 1683 even to reach the gates of Vienna at all. The state's land tenure and bureaucratic structuring, and most significantly, the military change of command, were rocked by one upheaval after another. In all likelihood, the fact that the siege actually took place and even achieved initial success is owing partly to the turmoil caused in Central Europe by the 30 Years' War, partly to the waning but still felt superiority of the Ottoman troops, and in some measure to the failure of the Austrian land to develop. We know that among the various religious and linguistic groups which came under the Ottoman sway, certain movements, or at least stirrings, that could be described in some cases as cultural and in others as national, began to make their presence felt in the 16th century. To call the events of 1789 the cause for national awakening in the Balkans cannot be an entirely prudent course for the historian to take. The national consciousness of the Balkan peoples was a feature of their medieval heritage that survived the Ottoman period, with every community having its own schools and its own guilds helping to regulate economic life. Thus, national identity, or, if one prefers, early nationalism, has its roots for the people of the Balkans as far as the Renaissance. It is no mere coincidence that the ideas put forward by Machiavelli in The Prince were greatly in vogue at the end of the 16th century and at the beginning of the 17th among the intelligentsia and in certain courts and in certain Slavic communities. Furthermore, the spontaneous peasant uprising that occurred in the 16th century, or the Hajduk movements opposing local Ottoman authority, show that to some extent, at any rate, national identity in the Balkans had not completely disappeared. The nationalist movement of the Balkan peoples and the way in which these movements developed were quite different from those to be found in the various countries of Western Europe. They are also different, I am speaking of the 18th and 19th century Balkans, from the national movement of today's world. Under the social, economic, and legal order imposed by the Ottomans, the hereditary aristocracy in the Balkans ceased to develop, and a native aristocracy in existence before the 14th century had all but died out. So it was the nationalist movement of the Balkan Slav developed, first and foremost with the participation of the church, to which, starting in the 18th century, was allied in rising commercial bourgeoisie and, in time, the peasantry. In opposition to nationalism stood Ottomanness, but not Ottomanism, a way of life and a social order, but not yet an ideology. Only after the 18th century would Ottomanness begin to evolve into an ideology, which in turn was to be altered by the influence of Balkan nationalism, until finally the empire's Muslims were too caught up in the wave, clamoring for their own national existence. The church conducted a campaign in which Christianity and national ideology were at the very least conjoined, and in doing so played a highly active ideological role in the national movements of liberation. The very existence of the church and the process of its evolution bore within them the seeds of dispute between the Ottoman rulers and the Orthodox believers, disputes which were naturally to affect the nationalist movement. Part 2. From the moment of its inception in the 14th century and all throughout its spectacular rise for the following 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was, in fact, a Balkan empire. The Ottoman culture and way of life had, it would seem, long since received the stamp of the Balkan and Mediterranean cultures, with the corollary that, under an understanding of Ottoman society, is hardly possible without a previous knowledge of medieval Byzantium and the structure of the Balkan states. In the middle of the 15th century, the peoples who owed allegiance to the Eastern Orthodox Church lived under Ottoman rule. The second Orthodox state was Tsarist Russia. Mehmed II, the conqueror, followed a deliberate policy of favoring unilateral rule in the church. He appointed as patriarch Gennadios, virulent enemy of Rome, and displayed towards him a consideration greater than he had enjoyed during Byzantine times. The patriarchs of Constantinople now enjoyed a position in the official protocol. In addition, the Bulgarian and Serbian churches had been deprived of their autocephaly with a spiritual, administrative, financial, and judicial authority over all Balkan orthodoxy devolving on the Patriarch in Constantinople. In these circumstances, Greeks living in the Ottoman land enjoyed prerogatives and a general prominence. For just as the Orthodox Church had autonomy and privilege, the Greek tongue under the empire and Greek education were able to go their way unhindered. To a certain extent, Byzantine legal heritage continued to exist and be applied. The Sublime Porte edicts were drawn up in Greek, which thrived as a semi-official language. Over and beyond these distinctions, the Greeks were the sole non-Muslim group to be employed in the bureaucracy and in chancellery service. In this respect, the Greeks were better off than any other ethnic group, the Turks included. For until the 18th and 19th century, the Turks, usually thought of as the heart of the empire, took only a limited part in governing, and the very name Turks was used to mean uncouth peasant lout. Authors of Ottoman times are insistent in saying that Turkish element must not be allowed to meddle in the business of government. Turk was an insulting epithet not only among the Ottoman meritocracy, but also among the Istanbul populace at large. For example, Baba Himmet, the most idiotic, unlovable figure in the Turkish shadow theater, is constantly referred to as the Turk. The Greeks were a seafaring people. They had had relations with Italy and Central Europe since the Renaissance, and they were viewed with feelings of kinship by Europe as a whole. It was then only natural that they would have nationalist sentiments from a very early date, but this under European patronage. Meanwhile, Ottoman supremacy was making it possible for the Greek Patriarchate to exert monolithic control over Orthodox Slavs in the Balkans, which in turn encouraged the strengthening of resistance and nationalist feelings in the latter. In the 18th and 19th century, the Patriarchate was as unwelcome to the Bulgarians as was the Sublime Porte. The Bulgarian national movement strove from the outset to establish an independent church and succeeded in doing so during the second half of the 19th century. Ottoman rule was never a threat to the survival of Greek education and culture. From the 17th century on, schools were opened by wealthy Greek merchants, not only in the Peloponnese and Epirus, but also in western Anatolia and on the Black Sea coast. This process continued in Cyprus and Crete after the fall of the Ottomans. The positive contribution of Europe to the Greek Enlightenment came not only in these schools, but also thanks to the children of the commercial bourgeoisie who early on began receiving their education in Europe. Another point was that the Ionian Islands were not beholden to the Sultan, and therefore came under Italian and French cultural influence, on account of which the local Greeks were more exposed to classical Greek culture and modern humanism. These islands, in turn, exerted their cultural influence on all Ottoman Greeks. On them, there was a widespread learning of French, Italian, and English, and classical Greek, in its choicest form, was a medium of instruction. In the early 18th century, when Austria became commercially and politically more influential along the shores both of the Adriatic and the Danube, a sizable number of Greeks, having in view political, commercial, or cultural aims, migrated to major Austrian cities from Epirus, Macedonia, and the Ionian Islands, and there established their own churches and their own schools. Having been the first to establish contact with Europe, the Greeks wasted no time in exerting a cultural and ideological influence over all other Balkan peoples. Undeniably, Bulgarian monks in their monasteries in Mount Athos made contact with the newly enlightened Greek culture, and in the Balkans this culture just as undeniably became institutionalized. In 1694, Prince Constantine Bricevenu set up for the Romanians the Saint Sava's Academy, where instruction was given in Greek. Before long, the Balkans had established direct cultural ties with Western Europe. In fact, it would be a mistake to explain the emergence of the national problem in the Balkans entirely by the Greek Enlightenment, or, as we have said, by the French Revolution. A certain idea of irredentism or Slav unity can be seen among the Balkan Slavs as early as the 16th century. When Ottoman rule led to the bestowing of all spiritual authority on the Patriarch in Constantinople, the Balkan Slav found themselves deprived of independence not only in religious matters but equally in questions of language, law, and education. Pushed by those adverse circumstances, the Balkan Slavs turned on to Russia, a sovereign power. It is possible that the first glimmerings of Slav irredentism were born from the ideas of Machiavelli, engaged as they were in intense cultural and commercial relations with the Renaissance of Italy. It cannot be coincidence that Ragusan and Croatian thinkers make mention in their writings of a kind of Slavic unity and liberation. In 1626, the Ragusan poet Ivan Gandulik, in his lyric poem Osman, speaks of liberation and the unity of the Slavs in a style reminiscent of Tasso's. It was Gundulik's belief that this historic mission could only be accomplished under the aegis of the Polish king. One of the most striking instances of this phenomenon is the Croatian priest, philosopher, and historian Juraj Križanik. Having settled in Russia, he proposed that all Slavs unite under the leadership of the Tsar and the Church of Catholic tendency to break away from the Ottomans. To accomplish this historical task, he recommended the modernization of Russia, a build-up of its might, and reform of its church and social system. Needless to say, his views were highly unpopular with clerics and conservatives, and were quickly forgotten. An active role for Russia was one recurrent theme in the discussions of national awakening among the Balkan Slavs. Balkan historians, no less than those in Turkey, at one period laid great emphasis on the expansion of the Russian role, and 19th century European thought tended also to see Russia as the most active element in, quote, the Eastern question, unquote. Now, although there is no arguing that, with the fact that this role increased following the Treaty of Kujuk-Kainarka, 1774, it would nevertheless be wrong to consider the Russian role as the most dominant factor in 17th and 18th century Balkan nationalism. In fact, as can be seen in the example of Križanik, ideologically, the Balkan Slavs were ahead of Russia. Russia's role became more influential as she developed and modernized. The westerning process in Muscovite Russia began after the 16th century. The period of Romanov dynasty, in particular, saw the establishment of permanent ambassadorial relations with the whole of Western Europe, and Russian merchants were familiar with cities in Scandinavia, Germany, and Poland. This improving political and commercial relations could not but introduce into Russia, however slowly, a Western style of living. A number of noblemen began furnishing their homes in European fashion, at the same time adopting Renaissance and Baroque, always with German customs. Russian culture at this period began to be acquainted, through translation, with European literature and science. One such Europeanized noble was Knez Golitsyn, favorite of the regent Sophia. Russia had long set her sights on becoming the successor to Byzantium, and there were now many Balkan Slavs and Greeks intellectuals and members of the church with their marches. These arrivals worked on libraries or in the palace print house, did translation from Greek and Old Church Slavonic, or tutored the children of wealthy families. On their visits back to the Balkans, they took with them numerous books of a religious, literary, or political nature. About the middle of the 17th century, we see in the Balkans the beginnings of a certain Russian political influence. One instance of this is the first printing press in the Moldovan city of Laci, which went into operation in 1640 thanks to the good offices of Pyotr Mogila, metropolitan at Kiev. As time went by, Balkan Slavs were slowly more and more closely cultural developments in Russia. Russia's relations with the Balkan Slavs, unlike those of Western Europe, came not through the channels of trade, but through the church. From the 17th century on, Serbian, Montenegrin, Romanian, and later Bulgarian priests were in contact with Russia. Between 1557 and 1766, the Ipek Patriarch in Serbia, which performed this function autonomously, experienced financial and administrative difficulties, which meant that the survival of Serbian monasteries and churches was to some extent only possible with the help of Russia. Each year, Serbian priests carried to Russia a number of manuscripts and icons. These priests, some of them admitted into Moscow, others turned back at the border with a gift of alms, began in the 18th century to bring with them lay publications as well. The Russian Church made extensive use of Balkan priests and the manuscripts in Balkan monasteries starting in the 17th century. As C. Rochel points out, quote, during the period of Russian church reforms in the mid-17th century, requests for manuscripts and books were frequently sent to Serbian monasteries. In 1655, for example, 3 Highlander monks carried to Moscow 11 handwritten books, 7 Old Slavonic, 4 Greek, which had been specifically requested by the Russian Patriarch Arseny Sukhanov. They were to be used according to the official request to correct Russian religious books. End of quote. It was nevertheless true that compared to Montenegro, Wallachia, Moldavia, and Bulgaria, Serbian monastic life after 1690 was to a certain extent culturally influenced by the Habsburg Empire. This was behind the choice made by D. Obradović, best known of all Serbian clerics, to substitute secular for religious learning. After 1804, Obradović became Karagiorgi's secretary and superintendent of Serbian schools. The one most important factor in the persistence of church leadership in the Balkan national awakening was the ability of the clerics to adopt secular education and secular views. They were the first to pen popular works on subjects such as history and geography. Foremost among such priests were the Serbians Jovan Rajic and the Romanians G. Sinchai, Petru Major, and Samuel Klein. Finally, Paisij Hilanderski, justly considered the father of Bulgar nationalism in his writings at the Hilander monastery on Mount Athos in 1762 of the first popularized Slavgan Bulgarian history, and after him Sofronish Vrakansky, are two typical examples of Balkan Slav church clerics contributing to the development of Bulgarian national feeling. Throughout the 18th century, such men were busy translating works from ancient Greek and Old Church Slavonic into contemporary languages, and were thus instrumental in transforming the vernacular into polished literary language. In this matter, they were very different from the Greek priests, who persisted in the use of a language remote from the colloquial. It is true that Balkan Slav always had a xenophobic attitude towards the Roman Church, but they were impelled by the presence of the Constantinople Patriarch, which they viewed as more oppressive than their Ottoman rulers, into entering the idea of an alliance with the Catholic Church in order to obtain cultural and spiritual autonomy for the Slavic peoples. To some extent, this idea was put into action. we know of active centers of Catholic propaganda in Bulgaria and Romania, not very successful enterprises which date back almost to the beginning of Ottoman rule in the region. The French envoy to Istanbul, Girardin, writes in his report of 13 February 1686 that a Bulgarian Orthodox priest had approached him with a petition directed to the French king, in which the Bulgarians are declared ready to convert to Catholicism and to seek the protection and intervention of the king. It should not come as a great surprise to meet with such a bid in the years immediately following the rout at Vienna. The Bulgarian historian B. Chikova says that during the war year there was an increase in the Hajduk movements along the banks of the Danube. The petition sent in 1688 to Tsar Ivan IV and to Peter I by the Vlachian ruler Serban Kanakutsen is well known. It contained a declaration of intent of the part of the Serbians, Bulgarians, and Moldovians to aid the Russians if they advanced to Ackerman. The rout at Vienna, in their third century of Ottoman sway, had an accelerating effect upon this reaction. Part 3. One of the most important outcomes of the Second Siege of Vienna was the strengthening of the Habsburg Empire, politico-military power in Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean, and the improvement of its commercial position. The spreading commercial influence went hand in hand with the increased cultural influence, while internally Ottoman Europe entered a time of crisis, brought on by the defeat in which prolonged deficiencies in the military, administrative, and economic mechanisms led inevitably to a process of decentralization in the provinces. This process was witnessed not only in the Balkans but in Anatolia as well, and it meant the beginning of momentous structural changes. Until the end of the 17th century, Austrian trade, whether foreign or domestic, was not at a level to enhance tax revenues. Because of her lack of control over the territories along the Danube, Austria's river-based commerce had also failed to develop. Another barrier to the flourishing of trade on Austrian soil was a paucity of trade relations among the German states belonging to the Holy Roman Empire. Having almost no access to the Mediterranean, Austria had not taken to the seaways to project her power abroad. Nor was it any help that roads in the country were terribly primitive compared to those of Western Europe. One primary factor in the Ottoman defeat in 1683 was the deteriorated state of the road system in Niederösterreich. Following the treaties of Karlowitz and Passarowitz, however, 1699 and 1718, the Habsburg Empire moved into the Danubian basin, making possible inroads into Balkan commerce. The Balkans became a market and a source of raw materials. When, in 1719, Karl VI opened Trieste as a major port to rival Venice, it meant the launching of Austria's career in the Mediterranean. During the 18th century, she signed navigation acts with the Ottomans to secure safety of passage in their waters, and thus, legal or illegal, trade carried on throughout the Mediterranean and the Balkans. In the vanguard, with a fleet of 600 ships, came the Greeks. This bourgeoising of commerce and Austrian manufacturers facilitated the emergence in the Balkans of a commercial bourgeoisie. In the 18th century, the growth of raw materials and semi-manufactured goods, oriented towards the demands of industry, wrought changes in the cities of the Balkans. To the Ottoman Empire's senior commercial people, the Greeks, were now added Serbo-Croatians and Bulgarians. During the 18th century, cultural renovation at the national level developed parallel to the emergence of the commercial bourgeoisie among all Balkan peoples. In the European cities of Livorno, Naples, Trieste, Venice, and Vienna, and in certain cities of Russia, there appeared sizable groups of merchants, religious clerics, and students, as churches and cultural centers sprang up. It was in the wake of these events that the effects of the European Enlightenment truly began to make themselves felt. 18th century philosophers such as Voltaire, Diderot, Herder, and Lessing became known to the Balkan intelligentsia. Albanians in southern Italy, Serbs in the cities of Central Europe, Bulgarians in Romania, all these groups enjoyed a culture and an education that was Western in orientation. Austrian influence in the Balkans was particularly great during the Enlightenment, during the 18th and 19th century. One factor in this was the cultural flourishing of the Western slaves within the Habsburg Empire. There is increasing recognition of the importance on Balkan cultural development of Austrian and Hungarian Baroque culture, literature, theater, and plastic arts. Following the Second Siege of Vienna, the Ottoman Empire's Balkan provinces were immediately thrown into turmoil, lawlessness, and economic collapse. The heavy taxation necessitated by war and the attempt to enforce order brought on similar collapse in Anatolia. The rout of the army, the attrition of garrisons assigned to enforce order in the cities, the crumble of the economy, the disappearing of safety on the highways, and the fighting of wars that never seemed to be over, all spelled a virtual end to central government control in the Balkans. The citizenry of Bosnia, for example, made repeated appeals to Istanbul for funds and military assistance, appeals which the central government was unable to answer. As a result, people in the cities had to recourse to law enforcement on their own. From the beginning of the 18th century, problems of security and finance in the Rumelian cities began to be solved by the people in concert with local notables, the ayans, who were local landowners and administrators of pious foundations, known as waqf, assumed surrogate authority in the cities. Peter Sugar has described in detail this coming to the fore of local authority in the cities and provinces of Rumelia. The Muslim beys, who were the descendants of minor Bosnian aristocrats who converted to Islam immediately after the Ottoman conquest, had, through the viziers and sanjak beys that they produced throughout the Ottoman reign, always managed to stay on good terms with the central administration. Now, although remaining loyal to the Sultan, they were impelled by the anarchy that follows long wars to take over the reins of local government. In the face of peasant uprising and the specter of roving Hajduk Hans, Istanbul looked upon this new decentralization and shift of authority with benevolence. The local population, of course, preferred these new rulers, who, by language and tradition, were Bosnian, and the governor was often nothing than an honored guest. It was the local lords who ran the province as they pleased. The same conditions could be said to have prevailed in the Albania-Epirus region. The situation in the Anatolian Peninsula was different only by a nuance. The process of land concentration that had continued since the 16th century had led to the emergence of a new class of local landlords. The Timariot system of military enfeoffment had broken down, and troops could no longer be summoned to battle as in the past. The keeping of order in the Anatolian towns and provinces at this period had largely been left to local power groups and representatives. The people by now habitually sought protection with the local rulers in the face of heavy taxation and the depredations of the ever-present hajduk. Decentralization had become a fact of life. From the 18th century onwards, the presence of this new governing class would lead to profound changes in social and political structure of the Ottoman Empire. Part 4. In the year 1685, the Sultan bestowed upon the bandit chieftain Yegin Osman the title of Beylerbey, or Governor General. The decision to do so was hardly an outpouring of generosity, for Osman had gathered around him a powerful force of rebellious peasants, stoic souls who had finally had enough of being plundered whenever their village became the target of tax agents or imperial soldiers who had deserted. The central Ottoman power was weary, depleted by constant war with Venice, Poland, and the Tsar. There seemed no choice but to distribute titles, ranks, and honor to bandit chieftains in the hope of pitting them against robber bands and rebels. A report drawn by the French envoy Guillergues in March of 1684 depicts a country in total disarray. Quote, "Highly placed commanders and functionaries are constantly being replaced. Administrative authority is stricken with paralysis." End quote. During the war years, the Timariots had raided and appropriated each other's holdings, thus increasing land concentration. There was more frequent seizure of land and local power in a fashion that simply bypassed the central government, as repeatedly shown by the official records of the time and in the edicts issued by the Sultan. Meanwhile, armies of bandits, deserting troops, and Timariots, heedless of their fealty, added another dimension to the growing anarchy. In these circumstances, with the central government unable to wield authority, responsibility was assumed by local notables called ayans, who became, in place of the pashas, administrators, both in matters of government and in the originally cosmopolitan recruitment. During the long decades of turbulence, the government was to appoint to positions of responsibility army officers who had distinguished themselves in Anatolia, and local figures who had proven themselves capable of preserving order in their own territory. Replacing the valleys, these local lords, known as muteselemins, represent an important change, for where before one had desvrised children recruited and trained in the Enderun palace school, who went on to take up the reins of central rule, now, from the 18th century onwards, this role was to fall more and more frequently upon the Anatolians, those who, in Ottoman terms, had always been regarded as crude Turks. So it is that the renowned Grand Viziers and military commanders of the 18th century are mostly of Turkish extraction. Ibrahim Pasha and Halid Hamid Pasha, both reform instituting Grand Viziers in the Tulip Age, are typical examples of this new administrative class. This increase of the Turkish presence in administration lost little time in making itself felt in art and culture as well. In a feudal society, the tastes and demands of the ruling class are bound to be carefully considered by artists of every stamp. The poets of the 18th century, when divan poetry was the literature of highest class, to some extent abandoned the tortuous loquations of an Arabic and Persian Latin style in favor of purer Turkish. The language of poets such as Nabi and Nedim is far closer to the Turkish of ordinary people of Istanbul than had been that of earlier poets. What is more, The content too of poetry became livelier and closer to reality. Sadi, in particular, of the poets of his time, openly pleaded for the written word to reflect the spoken language. As he put it, quote, "If the audience for a poem has to look everything up in the dictionary, how can you call it then a Turkish poem?" End of quote. On the military plane, the rout at Vienna made speedy and efficacious reform a necessity. When imperial schools of military engineering were opened, the very first piece of business was to translate textbooks from foreign languages. In doing so, every effort was made to see that the vocabulary was Turkish rather than Arabic or Persian, since most of the students were Turk of humble origin. Such scholars as Shanizade and Hoja Ishak, although active in the fields of geography, medicine, chemistry, and mathematics, took their terminology from Latin, also did their best to find purely Turkish equivalents. 18th century Turkish is still virgin terrain for the researcher, but one thing is clear: the language of bureaucracy, education, and literature was brought closer to the spoken tongue, as the Arabat and the Persified jargon of Ottoman began to give way to a more Turkish idiom. The dominance of the Turkish ethnic element in government and culture was a platform from which Turkish nationalism could rise in the centuries to come, but for a time no more than that. In the 18th century, it is still too early to speak of the emergence, within the Ottoman Empire, of a Turkish nationalism rooted in the Turkish ethnic element. The first unmistakable examples of Turkish nationalism came in the 1860s with the book Le Turc Ancient et Moderne by Mustafa Celadin e Pasha, a Pole who had come to Turkey in 1849 as a refugee, and with the admonition directed by Ahmet Vefik Pasha to a Syrian Christian member of the first Ottoman parliament. Quote, "If you know what is good for you," he said, "you will learn Turkish." End of quote. Always the official language, Turkish was first proclaimed as such in the Constitution of 1876, and it would take until the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century for Turkishness to become the seed of nationalism. Throughout the 18th century, nationalism in the Ottoman Empire was confined to the Balkans, as Anatolia witnessed no more than a strong process of purification. Because of this process, however, the empire in the 18th century rapidly began to lose its centuries-old cosmopolitan character. With the loss of the Central European eyalets, provinces, through the treaties of Karlovitz and Passarowitz, national developments all through the Balkans, and in the beginnings of the intervention by the European powers, a new Islamic ideology began to emerge in the empire during the 18th century. For the first time in Ottoman history, fanatism would wound its way into religious life and thought. The institutions and title of caliphate took on a far greater importance. At the same time, of course, the threat posed to the empire by Europe made it vital to modernize and become acquainted with developments in the West. At this period, the report drawn up by the Sultan's ambassador to Berlin, Azmi Effendi, speaks in glowing terms of Prussia, both as a state and social order. It goes on to make various suggestions for Ottoman reform. Self and commune, so long a hallmark of the Ottomans, had clearly become a thing of the past. In architecture, Central European influence had brought a new Baroque style, visible in the eyalets, as it is in the mosques, barracks, and palaces of the epoch in Istanbul. In Ottoman painting as well, European influence was not restricted to Istanbul. The new style appeared also throughout Anatolia and the Balkans. There are grounds for the claim that this 18th century style was less refined then than the classical to Ottoman, but on the other hand, there is a welcome infusion of movement and a variety after the set, static forms of the centuries that preceded. Contributions of the West to 18th century Ottoman painting include perspective, landscape, and the depiction of the human form. There are no aspects of daily life not touched in some manner by the wave of modernization and westernization. That this would hasten the process of Turkification is only natural, if we consider that printing presses began at this period turning out works in Turkish, thus making science and art available to a broader range of people. There is an 18th century canvas, an instance of Austrian folk art that depicts by means of stereotypes the nations of Europe. Beside the Spaniard, the Frenchman, the Swede, and the Muscovite, we find the most antipathetic evil personage to be a turbaned figure wearing a kaftan. Curiously, he is labeled Turk or Greek. But this European ignorance of Turkish affairs would soon give way to an interest that led to serious research. In the first half of the 18th century, a number of students at the Lycée Louis Le Grand in Paris began receiving instruction in Turkish, while in Vienna, Eastern languages were introduced into the curriculum of the Maria Teresa Academy. By the end of the century, Europe could boast of such famous Turkologues as Joseph von Hammer. As Turkology came into its own in Europe, a source of future inspiration for Turkish nationalism developed, in the form of linguistic and historical inquiries. In the Central European cities, the 18th century marked the beginning of Balkanistic as well as Turkological studies, the effects of which were seen among both peoples. During that century, all the nations of Europe were busy studying one another's histories, language, and ways, a pursuit that went hand in hand with the Long War, with its consequent loss of territories, was in some sense the beginning of a historical process that would result in the birth and further growth of belated nationalism among the Turks.